Hi, my name is Dr. Bob Nicholson, and I'm a lecturer in history at Edge Hill University in the northwest of England. I specialise in the history of Victorian popular culture, and right now I'm a man on a mission, so I'm trying to find and revive Victorian jokes. I'm also one of the lucky winners of this year's British Library Labs competition, which has given me the chance to work with the British Library and the Labs team on a brand new digital project that we're calling the Victorian Meme Machine. And in a nutshell, it's going to try and do two things. Firstly, we're going to create a new online archive of Victorian jokes that researchers, members of the public, novelists, anybody who wants to can have a browse through. Secondly, and I guess a bit more ambitiously, we're going to try and find a way to bring these old jokes back to life, to find a way of making them, well, funny again. It's going to be easier said than done, but hopefully in this presentation I'm going to give you an indication of how we're going to go about doing it. In a minute I'll tell you all about how we're going to create our database and then how we're going to convert these jokes into new forms of humour. But first, a little bit of background on the history, or rather ignored history, of Victorian comedy.
Whenever I tell people that I work on the history of Victorian comedy, the first challenge that I have is to convince them that it actually exists. Because, well, let's face it, when most people imagine a typical Victorian, they probably think of something like this. Rather gloomily dressed figures staring back at us, stony-faced from sepia photographs. We think of them as prudish exponents of the stiff upper lip, not the kind of people, in other words, who are likely to enjoy a good laugh. Photographs of Queen Victoria almost always present her as looking incredibly glum. In fact, the quotation most famously attributed to her sums up the situation nicely. "We are not amused," she is supposed to have said, speaking as if for the whole nation. There's actually little evidence that she ever said this, but nevertheless it's come to symbolise the way that we imagine the whole period as a time devoid of humour. And these preconceptions run deep. I'd like to think that I've developed a fairly nuanced understanding of 19th century culture by now, but even I found myself feeling surprised when I saw these photographs of Victorians smiling and laughing. It just seems so at odds with how we imagine the period. And maybe as a result we know relatively little about what might have been making these women laugh. The great works of Victorian art fill the nation's galleries. Literature from the period is still taught in our schools and adapted into period dramas. We're all aware of the Victorians' achievements in the fields of science, industry and art. We celebrate these things. But if you were to ask most people to name a great Victorian comedian or tell a Victorian joke, they'd probably draw a blank. Outside of a few great works of literary humour and the odd witty quip by Oscar Wilde, we've largely lost touch with the things that made ordinary Victorians laugh. In large part, this is because a lot of Victorian comedy simply hasn't survived. Much of it was performed live in the pubs and music halls, and of course it was never recorded. Rather ominously, when I did a Google image search for the term Victorian comedian, the first result was this gravestone. Some precious fragments of this oral culture have been uncovered. A few years ago, Jackie Bratton and Anne Featherston published this great gag book of a Victorian clown, a collection of 200 jokes that he used to perform live. This was a fantastic find, but it's only a tiny fragment of all the jokes that were written and told during this period. Fortunately though, a much larger number of Victorian jokes have been preserved in another source, that is, the press. Now again, we might imagine that the typical Victorian newspaper was a rather dry affair. Political reports, stock market bulletins, maybe a bit of foreign correspondence. And while this might have been true of weighty daily papers like the Times, readers of more popular weekly papers were actually supplied with much more entertaining content. Football scores, fashion advice, serialised fiction, and, crucially, a regular supply of the latest jokes. And these would appear each week in a dedicated column. You can see a few examples here. And they often contain more than 30 gags at a time. Some of them clipped from British papers, others imported from America. Over the course of a year, a single newspaper might print more than 1,500 jokes. Many of these columns ran for decades at a time. 30 years of just one newspaper gets us something like 50,000 jokes. So far we've found these columns in at least 10 papers in the library's digital archives. I'm sure they'll be in much more. It's too early to say how many jokes we'll get from this, but 500,000 certainly doesn't seem out of the question, and I'm aiming at the big million. Whatever happens, we should have enough to build a seriously substantial archive.
So that's our mission, to try and find a way to extract these thousands, maybe even millions of jokes from Victorian newspapers, to convert them into a research database and then to make them funny again. Here is how we're going to do it.
The first step of the project, and the one that we're actually working on right now, is to find a way of extracting all of these jokes from the newspaper archives. Fortunately, because they've been gathered into these dedicated columns, we should be able to grab a lot of them fairly easily. We're currently working on a way to search for a collection of columns with the same header, like Jokes of the Day or Homespun Humour, and then pull them out of the database all at once. In the future, as we begin to learn more about the style and presentation of these jokes, we might attempt a more sophisticated joke recognition system designed to identify possible gags that are scattered among the papers of the content as column fillers. For now, though, the dedicated columns will give us more than enough to work with. In truth, the bigger challenge will be figuring out a way to turn these scans of joke columns into high-quality digital text. The standard of the existing OCR is pretty patchy. Here, for example, we see that several words in the joke have been misspelled, and there are a lot of superfluous characters and formatting errors. We're considering running the columns through a new and more sophisticated OCR package, but it's unlikely to give us perfect results. The quality of the original images is simply too low. So I suspect that we're going to have to rely in a large part on human transcription. The ideal way to do this would be to follow the example of projects like Transcribe Bentham and Dickens Journals Online, and do it all via a crowdsourcing platform. I'd love to do this, and we're exploring this option, but there are some pretty significant technical and legal issues to resolve before we can really commit to it. For now, we're arranging for a small team of volunteers to help us start transcribing an initial sample of the jokes. If you'd like to volunteer, then please do get in touch.
So that's how we're going to approach the extraction process. But in order to create a high quality database of Victorian jokes, we need to do more than just transcribe the jokes themselves. We also need to start capturing some of the metadata.
We'd like to take this beyond the usual publication details and tag the jokes with other important information. So this will include the subject of the joke, the characters that appear within it, the location in which it takes place, and also its style. So here's an example. This will be tagged as a conversational joke because it features two characters talking to one another. The words woman and lawyer will be identified as character keywords, while Chicago captures the location. This tagging process could be done during the initial transcription, or perhaps more realistically, bit by bit later on as people begin to use the database. Once complete, it should allow us to interrogate the dataset in powerful new ways. You'll be able to see at a touch of a button all the jokes about Victorian mother-in-laws.
So once this process of extraction, transcription and tagging is completed, we should end up with a really high quality research database of Victorian jokes, potentially thousands of them, that haven't been seen since the day that they were published. I think a whole range of users will be able to engage with this database in potentially some really interesting different ways. Members of the public will be able to browse through looking for funny jokes amongst all the terrible ones. Researchers will be able to identify jokes on a particular topic that interests them. People who are working in the digital humanities or corpus linguistics will be able to download the dataset and analyse it from a distance using corpus linguistic tools. Novelists might even be able to look through this to try and find material to place in their novels. Anybody who is interested, I think, in Victorian culture or the history of comedy will find something here to interest them. And hopefully in the process, we'll begin to see the Victorians in new and illuminating ways. But we didn't want to leave things there, with these jokes preserved as lifeless objects in a museum. Because if we really do our job properly, we should be able to revive these jokes and hopefully try and make them funny, or at least interesting again, to new audiences, not just people who are interested in history. And that's where the second phase of this project comes in, where the project really, I suppose, becomes the Victorian meme machine. Because what we're going to try and do is convert these jokes into new forms of humour inspired by the kind of jokes that do the rounds on the internet. Here is how it's going to work.
When a joke has been tagged, users will have the opportunity to then send it out to the meme machine. At this point, it'll begin to search through a collection of the library's digital images in order to find one that pairs well with the joke. Once a good match has been found, the joke will be superimposed onto the image, thus creating the meme. These reimagined versions of the joke will then be sent out over social media. We'll try and keep an eye on which ones go viral and then reprogram the meme machine accordingly. Hopefully over time it's going to develop something like a good sense of humour. Now there are several ways in which these new images might be formatted. For example, we could simply piggyback on existing internet culture and try to find ways to pair our jokes with existing meme formats. So for example, the bad joke eel is commonly used specifically for lame puns. You can see it in the top left. I imagine we'll probably get plenty of good use out of it. The dad joke dog appears in the middle of this image and works in much the same way. It's designed for terrible jokes. However, some of our jokes are presented as news stories, which allows us to use different memes, such as this one from Anchorman. There are also some question-based jokes that fit well with the Velociraptor meme. If all else fails, we can just go with the facepalm. Fitting Victorian jokes into this context is an interesting challenge, but I think we'll also try to come up with our own images. I'm really keen to find a way to automatically convert conversational jokes into comics. Here, for example, we see the joke about the Chicago lawyer superimposed onto what seems like an appropriate image of a woman in a lawyer's office. What I love about this, though, is that by changing the criteria slightly, we can present the joke in new ways, ones that actually change the source of its humour. So here we see the two people appear as lovers, which gives the joke a different kind of vibe. We can also make things rather surreal, such as this bedroom escape, or my favourite, this rather desperate looking bear. All are essentially the same joke, but they're told in different ways when they're paired with different images. My gut feeling is that these rather surreal pairings are probably going to be our best bet for making these jokes funny again.
Now these image macros, these memes, these comics are only one way in which we might begin to imagine Victorian jokes in new kinds of ways. There are a whole range of other ways in which users might be able to reinterpret these jokes. For example, there are some jokes that would really lend themselves to being filmed as sketches and say hosted on YouTube. Others that are brief enough to maybe be told on Vine. If people are brave enough, they could even try them out as a real stand-up comedy set. I'm really keen to try and give these jokes to a professional comedian and see what they could come up with. We're also exploring the possibility of creating a mechanical comedian, a little bit like the British Library's mechanical curator, which sends out a series of images connected to one another every hour. We could do the same with jokes. It would be like a kind of ongoing, perpetual comedy routine going out on Twitter. So there are a whole range of things that we can do with this content, and really I think the most exciting thing will be to put this stuff online and simply invite people to do whatever they want with it. Hopefully they'll do something far funnier than I can imagine at this stage. So that's the project. It's in its early stages yet, we're still really planning what we're going to do, and who knows what we'll end up with in a few months' time. But there certainly will be opportunities, I hope, for, if you're interested, for you to get involved. So for example, we will be looking for people to help us transcribe the jokes. In time, we'll hopefully also be looking for people to help us reimagine the jokes in these new formats. So keep your eyes peeled. If you want to keep track of the project, you can keep your eye on the British Library Lab's website, my blog, which is the digitalvictorianist.com, or follow me on Twitter @digivictorian. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts or ideas in which we might make these Victorian jokes funny. I need all the help I can get. Thanks.